In January 2019, a quiet neighborhood in Chuluota, Florida became the scene of a shocking family tragedy that would later capture the attention of true crime audiences around the world. At the center of the story was a man named Grant Amato. From the outside, Grant Amato's life once appeared ordinary. He grew up in a middle-class family and lived with his parents and older brother in a comfortable home just outside Orlando. His father, Chad Amato, was a respected businessman who ran a successful air conditioning company. His mother, Margaret Amato, was known as a kind and supportive parent who cared deeply for her family. Grant's older brother, Cody Amato, worked alongside their father in the family business. To neighbors, the Amato family seemed stable and successful. But behind the quiet exterior of their home, a serious problem had been growing for months. And that problem centered on Grant. In his early adulthood, Grant had pursued a career in healthcare. He trained as a nurse anesthetist and began working in hospitals around Florida. For a while, his future appeared promising. But things began to change after he lost his job. According to investigators, Grant was eventually fired from a hospital after staff discovered he had been stealing medication meant for patients. The incident ended his medical career. Without a stable job, Grant returned to live with his parents. At first, the family hoped he would recover from the setback and rebuild his life. But instead, something very different happened. Grant began spending most of his time online. Hours turned into days, and days turned into months. Eventually, he became obsessed with a woman he had never met in person. The woman was a webcam model from Bulgaria named Sylvie Sava. She worked on adult live stream platforms where viewers could pay to chat privately or watch performances. For many viewers, these interactions were simply entertainment. But for Grant Amato, the relationship quickly became something far more serious. Investigators later discovered that Grant had begun sending large amounts of money to the model. At first, the payments were small. But over time, the amounts grew larger and larger. Soon, Grant was sending thousands of dollars. The problem was that he did not actually have that money. Instead, he began secretly taking it from his own family. Investigators later determined that Grant had transferred tens of thousands of dollars from family accounts to the webcam model. At one point, the total amount exceeded $200,000. When his family discovered the transfers, they were shocked. His parents confronted him about the money. They demanded that he stop sending payments and cut off contact with the woman. But Grant refused. According to family members, he insisted that the relationship was real. He claimed that the woman loved him and that they were planning a future together. His parents did not believe this. They believed Grant was being manipulated by someone online who was simply taking advantage of his obsession. The situation soon escalated into constant arguments inside the Amato household. Grant's father reportedly demanded that he end all communication with the webcam model. His brother Cody also became involved in the dispute. At one point, the family even attempted to help Grant seek professional counseling. They hoped therapy would help him break free from the online obsession. But nothing seemed to work. Instead, the conflict inside the home became more intense. In late 2018, Grant's parents finally made a decision. They told him he could no longer continue living in the house if he refused to stop sending money. They gave him strict rules. He had to cut off contact with the webcam model. He had to begin rebuilding his life. And he had to find a way to repay the money he had taken. Grant reluctantly agreed. For a short time, it seemed like the situation might improve. But investigators later discovered that Grant had secretly continued communicating with the model. And he had not given up on sending money. Behind the scenes, the conflict inside the family continued growing. Arguments became louder. Tensions became worse. The once peaceful household had become a place filled with frustration and anger. Then, in January 2019, everything would suddenly explode. On January 24, a friend of the Amato family became concerned when no one from the household answered phone calls. Something seemed wrong. Eventually, police were contacted. When deputies arrived at the Amato home, they discovered a horrifying scene. Inside the house, 3 members of the family had been shot and killed. Chad Amato, Margaret Amato, and Cody Amato. The quiet home in Chuluota had become the scene of a triple homicide. And investigators quickly began asking one crucial question. Where was Grant Amato? Because the only surviving member of the household was missing. Within hours, police launched a search. And when they finally located Grant, the investigation would begin uncovering one of the most disturbing stories of obsession, money, and betrayal. A story that would reveal how an online fantasy had slowly destroyed an entire family. After deputies discovered the bodies inside the Amato family home in Chuluota, Florida, the investigation immediately turned into a race to understand what had happened inside the quiet house. 3 members of the same family had been killed. Chad Amato, Margaret Amato, and Cody Amato were all found dead inside the residence. Each had been shot. The scene suggested the violence had occurred inside the home, but there were no immediate signs of forced entry. To investigators, that detail raised an important question. If no one had broken into the house, could the killer have been someone the victims knew? One person quickly became the focus of the investigation. The only surviving member of the household. Grant Amato. When deputies first arrived at the house, Grant was nowhere to be found. His car was missing. His phone appeared to be turned off. For several hours, investigators were unsure where he had gone. Then authorities began reviewing surveillance footage and financial records connected to Grant. Soon they discovered something unusual. Shortly after the estimated time of the murders, Grant had checked into a nearby hotel. Police quickly moved to locate him. Later that same day, officers arrived at the hotel and found Grant inside his room. He was taken into custody without resistance. At first, Grant claimed he had nothing to do with the murders. During questioning, he told detectives a strange story. According to Grant, he had been asleep in the house when he heard gunshots. He claimed he woke up, panicked, and fled the house without checking what had happened. But investigators quickly noticed several problems with his explanation. First, the timeline did not match the evidence. Second, there were no signs that an unknown attacker had entered the home. And third, the family's security cameras had recorded important details about the events leading up to the crime. Inside the Amato house, investigators discovered multiple surveillance cameras that had been installed by the family. These cameras had captured footage from the night of the murders. When detectives reviewed the recordings, the evidence began to paint a very different picture. According to investigators, the footage showed Grant inside the house shortly before the shootings occurred. The cameras also revealed movement in areas of the home where the victims had later been found. As detectives continued examining the evidence, they also discovered something else that raised serious concerns. After the murders, Grant had accessed his brother Cody's computer. Investigators later learned that he had used it to log into bank accounts and attempt to transfer money. The money was connected to the same obsession that had already caused months of conflict inside the family. The online relationship with the Bulgarian webcam model, Sylvie Sava. According to prosecutors, Grant had been sending enormous amounts of money to the model for months. Even after his family discovered the payments and tried to stop him, the obsession had continued. The financial damage to the family had been severe. Investigators believed the conflict over money had become one of the major sources of tension inside the house. Friends and relatives later told detectives that Grant's father had given him a final ultimatum shortly before the murders. He had to stop contacting the webcam model. And he had to repay the money he had taken. If he refused, he would no longer be allowed to live in the family home. According to investigators, the argument had reached a breaking point. Prosecutors would later argue that Grant believed his family was standing between him and the online relationship he had become obsessed with. After reviewing the surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and financial records, detectives believed they understood what had happened. They concluded that the murders had been committed inside the house by someone who knew the victims. And all signs pointed to Grant Amato. Soon after his arrest, prosecutors officially charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The charges meant he could face life in prison if convicted. As the case moved forward, more disturbing details began to emerge. Investigators discovered the exact amounts of money Grant had sent to the webcam model. The total shocked even experienced detectives. Over time, he had sent more than $200,000. Much of the money had been taken from family accounts. Some of it had been stolen directly from his parents. The obsession had drained the family financially. And prosecutors believed it had also destroyed the relationship between Grant and the rest of the household. As the trial approached, the story began attracting national attention. Many people were stunned by the bizarre nature of the case. An entire family destroyed by an online relationship with someone thousands of miles away. But the most important question had not yet been answered. Had Grant Amato truly killed his own parents and brother? Or was there another explanation for the horrific crime inside the Florida home? The answer to that question would soon be decided in a courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would present their versions of the story. And the details revealed during the trial would shock the public even more than the investigation itself. As the case against Grant Amato moved toward trial, investigators and prosecutors began preparing to present the full story of what had happened inside the Amato family home in January 2019. The crime had already shocked the local community in Chuluota, Florida. Now the legal process would attempt to answer the most important question of all. Why would a man kill his own family? Prosecutors believed the motive was connected to Grant's obsession with an online webcam model. For months before the murders, Grant had been communicating with a woman named Sylvie Sava. She lived thousands of miles away in Bulgaria and worked on a live stream website where viewers could pay for private conversations and performances. For most viewers, these interactions were temporary and transactional. But for Grant, the relationship appeared to become something far more serious. Investigators later discovered that he had sent enormous amounts of money to the model. The payments began small but quickly escalated. Eventually, Grant was transferring thousands of dollars at a time. When his family discovered the transfers, they were stunned. The total amount had grown into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Much of the money had been taken from family accounts. Some of it had even been stolen directly from his parents. According to prosecutors, the financial damage to the family had become severe. Grant's father, Chad Amato, eventually decided the situation could no longer continue. He confronted Grant and demanded that he end the online relationship immediately. Grant's mother, Margaret Amato, also tried to intervene. She reportedly hoped therapy might help him overcome the obsession. His brother, Cody Amato, also became involved in the confrontation. Family members later said Cody had strongly criticized Grant's behavior and demanded he take responsibility for the financial damage. The arguments inside the house became intense. Prosecutors would later describe the home as a place filled with constant conflict in the weeks leading up to the murders. Eventually, the family decided to give Grant a final chance. He would be allowed to stay in the house only if he agreed to strict conditions. He had to stop communicating with the webcam model. He had to find a job. And he had to begin repaying the money he had taken. For a short time, it appeared that Grant had agreed to these rules. But investigators later discovered that he had secretly continued communicating with the model online. The obsession had not ended. Instead, it appeared to be growing stronger. Prosecutors would later argue that Grant had become convinced that his family was standing between him and the life he wanted. As the trial approached, prosecutors began presenting their theory of the crime. They argued that the murders were not a sudden act of anger. Instead, they believed the killings had been planned. They pointed to the surveillance footage inside the house. They pointed to the timeline of events on the night of the murders. And they pointed to Grant's behavior afterward, including his attempt to access bank accounts and transfer money. All of this, they argued, showed clear intent. But the defense attorneys presented a very different argument. They did not deny that Grant had serious problems. They acknowledged the financial obsession and the conflict inside the family. However, they argued that the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence was not the only possible explanation. According to the defense, the investigation had focused too quickly on Grant without fully exploring other possibilities. They questioned whether the surveillance footage actually proved he had committed the murders. They also suggested that the timeline presented by prosecutors might not be completely accurate. The courtroom became the center of a tense legal battle. Witnesses were called to testify. Detectives described the crime scene. Financial experts explained the transfers of money. Friends and relatives spoke about the family's conflicts. Meanwhile, the name of the webcam model appeared repeatedly during the trial. But investigators confirmed that she had never met Grant in person and had no involvement in the crimes. For many observers, the case became a disturbing example of how online relationships can sometimes grow into dangerous obsessions. The idea that an internet fixation could lead to such violence shocked many people following the trial. But the most important moment of the case was still ahead. After weeks of testimony, the jury would soon be asked to make a decision. They would examine all the evidence. They would listen to the arguments from both sides. And they would decide whether Grant Amato was responsible for the deaths of his father, mother, and brother. The verdict would determine whether the young man who once lived quietly in his family's home would spend the rest of his life in prison. And it would finally reveal the outcome of one of the most disturbing family murder cases in recent American history. As the trial of Grant Amato reached its final stage, the courtroom became silent as both sides prepared their closing arguments. For weeks, the jury had listened to testimony from investigators, financial experts, family friends, and forensic specialists. Each witness had helped piece together the final hours inside the Amato family home in Chuluota, Florida. Now the responsibility of deciding Grant Amato's fate rested with 12 jurors. Prosecutors began their closing argument by reviewing the evidence they believed proved Grant's guilt. They reminded the jury of the financial obsession that had consumed Grant's life. Over many months, he had secretly transferred enormous sums of money to a webcam model thousands of miles away. The woman, Sylvie Sava, had never even met him in person. Yet Grant had sent her more than $200,000. Much of that money had been taken from his own family. According to prosecutors, this obsession had pushed Grant into constant conflict with his parents and brother. His father, Chad Amato, had demanded that the payments stop. His mother, Margaret Amato, had tried to convince him to seek help. And his brother, Cody Amato, had confronted him directly about the financial damage. Prosecutors argued that these confrontations created a powerful motive. Grant's family had become the only obstacle standing between him and the online relationship he refused to abandon. They then turned to the physical evidence collected during the investigation. Surveillance cameras inside the house had captured Grant moving through the home around the time the murders occurred. Forensic evidence showed that the victims had been shot inside the residence. And after the killings, Grant had attempted to access his brother's computer and transfer money from family accounts. To prosecutors, these actions revealed both motive and intent. They argued that the murders had been committed in order to remove the people who were trying to stop him. When the defense presented their closing argument, they attempted to raise doubts about the prosecution's conclusions. They suggested that the evidence did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Grant had committed the murders. They argued that the surveillance footage could be interpreted in different ways. They also emphasized that no eyewitness had seen the shootings take place. According to the defense, the investigation had focused too quickly on Grant without fully exploring other possibilities. But prosecutors returned to the timeline of events. They reminded the jury that Grant had been the only surviving member of the household. They pointed out that he had checked into a hotel shortly after the murders. And they described how he had attempted to access family bank accounts even after the deaths of his parents and brother. After the closing arguments ended, the jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations. For the families involved, the waiting period was emotionally exhausting. They had already endured months of grief and uncertainty. Now they waited for the final decision. After hours of discussion, the jury returned to the courtroom. The verdict was announced. Grant Amato was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The decision confirmed the prosecution's theory that he had killed his father, mother, and brother inside their own home. Later, the judge delivered the sentence. Grant Amato was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With that decision, the legal process reached its conclusion. The quiet home in Chuluota that once housed a close-knit family had become the scene of one of Florida's most disturbing family murder cases. For investigators, the case stood as a chilling example of how obsession and financial desperation could destroy an entire family. For the relatives and friends of the victims, however, the tragedy could never truly end. 3 lives had been lost. A father who had built a successful business. A mother known for her kindness. And a brother who had tried to help his struggling sibling. The story of the Amato family would remain a painful reminder of how quickly an obsession can spiral out of control. What began as an online relationship with a stranger eventually led to one of the most shocking family murder cases in modern true crime history.